Like I said, I'm Becky Steckler, the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon really does focus on how emerging technologies influence really the built environment. So we're paying attention to how people and goods are moving differently, new mobility and urban delivery, and eventually autonomous vehicles, and really thinking about how that impacts land use, urban design, building design, transportation, and real estate, and the implications of those changes on equity and health and safety, the economy, and the environment. And you're going to hear those themes really echoed today. I was thrilled for so many reasons to be able to work with NUMO and Carlos Pardo. Carlos, why don't you talk just a little bit, introduce yourself, and talk about NUMO's role in this project.
Hi, I'm Carlos Pardo. I'm the Senior Manager for Pilots in the new Urban Mobility Alliance, which is NUMO. And as part of what we wanted to do when we began this work in pilots or new mobility pilots was to understand what was actually happening in the different cities that we knew something had been going on. So then we talked to Becky and Urbanism Next and began this work, which we're going to show you now.
Excellent, thanks, Carlos. And this might be a little bit of a tag team. Carlos and I have been working, really partnering on this, and so a little bit more of a presentation between the two of us. And so I'm gonna go right to the final kind of what we did. And so what we really did is looked at 220 pilot projects around both the United States primarily, and then also some in Canada. And really, we knew all these pilot projects were happening. And the question that we had is, what are we learning from all these? I mean, a pilot kind of makes the assumption that it's really a learning exercise. And so we really wanted to kind of take a broad look at what was available easily online. So that was the 220, and I'll get a little bit more into detail. And then we actually dove in a lot deeper into 11 of the different case studies. And from all that, we would say that we had about 31 lessons that we learned, and we came up with 10 recommended actions. And so that's kind of what we're going to walk through today. And so in case you're wondering how we did all this, I had the most amazing technical advisory committee, and I know some of those folks are on the webinar today. So, just really thrilled with the participation and really helping to shape what is going to be of most interest for other mostly public agencies that are initiating pilot projects right now, but then also the different kinds of stakeholders that are interested in it. So what are, service providers, those companies telling us? We looked at the literature and policy review. Of course, we scanned information that was easily available online, did the deep dive, and part of that deep dive into the case studies was conducting the interviews with both the public and the private sector to get kind of a more nuanced information about what was going on. The one thing I will say is that the report was scheduled to come out right in March, and we had a slight delay. Actually came out in April, and of course that was right as everything was shutting down, and we saw such huge changes because of COVID. But it's been really interesting even since then to see how some of those pilots have pivoted even since the pandemic has really hit so hard and affected transportation. So, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end.
And just to start interrupting, that COVID thing is really important because it is basically an introduction to what was going to happen in COVID, which was doing pilots every day, everywhere. And I think all these things are relevant to what is happening now, despite the fact that the entire research was done before COVID struck.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlos. Just want to let folks know too, the things that we were really paying attention to was to understand what were some of the common goals and purposes of the projects, and then how are governments, kind of what are some of those models of governance that they're really applying to make these pilots happen. Data sharing was huge. What information are you collecting and for what different reasons? And we're going to explore that a little bit. Just thinking a little bit more about kind of those contracts and procurements, definitely for the folks who are public sector and have to think about those things. And then whether or not it was actually one of the stated goals, we were paying attention to what were the equity outcomes, health and safety, kind of environmental, greenhouse gas emissions, also in economic, what kind of jobs were being created, what were other kind of economic opportunities there. So these are just a few of the things that we were really paying attention to and trying to pull out. And so we did both kind of a quantitative and a qualitative, and I just wanted to show some of the information. I'm going to walk through the micromobility because that was the topic that, or the mode that really, I would say, had the most pilot projects from around the country. And it starts to give you a sense of, we found about 78 that we could say were really pilots and not just deployments. And I guess I want to make that clear. We really tried to find projects that were defined, that had some kind of a limited duration, so that people could really, communities can really learn from those. It was really interesting to see, what the percentage of different projects that were happening around the country and in Canada. When were they starting? You really saw pilots take off in 2018. And, looking at the duration, I was actually surprised at the number that were less than 5 months. But I know in some places there was a short pilot that was initiated and completed, and then then a new pilot was started that was longer, like maybe a year longer. So kind of get some of that sense. One of the things that were really interesting, and I'm going to do a comparison later on in the presentation, was looking at, what was the stated purpose of the particular pilots. And so, even looking at this, I thought it was interesting that just 15% of the pilots that stated, or just 12 of the pilots, 15%, actually said that they were really focusing on equity for micromobility. But just, increasing options, like almost a third of the pilots that stated something, stated a purpose, put that in there. So
And
we were paying attention to that.
22%, I mean, even 22% didn't really know what the purpose was, or they didn't state it so clearly, which was something that we thought was going to happen, but it was sort of, oh, it really does happen. People just say,
Yeah.
let's do a pilot. And that's sort of another interesting thing.
Yeah, like my dad used to say to me, when you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So I think that's the case here as well. And as I said, we also were paying attention to what were the different kinds of outcomes. And so in our report, we do list what were the different kinds of, equity-related outcomes. And here's some of just the most common for those that actually, mention and describe it. We definitely saw emphasis on those low-income plans. Really, also the ability to use the service with basically with cash, without a smartphone or credit card or bank accounts. That was also another strategy. There was several pilots that looked at adaptive equipment, so not just lower income equity concerns, but also for different mobility issues as well. But also we saw making sure that the vehicles themselves were in all different neighborhoods, or a variety of different neighborhoods, and definitely underserved neighborhoods. There was a number of health and safety outcomes that a lot of the jurisdictions also tracked, and that was anything from helmet requirements or certain speed limits, age restrictions, things like that. The environmental outcomes, and this is kind of a theme I think I'm going to keep on coming back to, is, how does this impact, the different modes that are selected? Is it reducing our dependence on single occupancy vehicles, or is it actually reducing kind of that BMT and giving people really an option, which kind of gets back to your goals? Are you achieving that goal by providing new options for people, and is it going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or is it potentially going to increase it? And there's, I would say, there's limited information to be able to actually say whether or not it does that or not. And then I would also say that there was a number of services that were really also trying to increase transit ridership. So really thinking about that first last mile. And on the economic outcomes, folks are paying attention to both the price, how those fees can be really support the infrastructure, as well as thinking about kind of some of the labor policies. There was a handful of pilot projects that were looking at, who's getting a job because of these pilot projects or these services down the road.
And we did try to sort of ask the question about joyfulness, whether that was explicitly stated somewhere, just because in NUMO we have that term somewhere in our definition. So we tried, it wasn't so prevalent, but anyway, it's
It
another
was
of the
hard.
questions.
Yeah, a lot of people, we did ask them when we did our interviews, and I would say the micromobility services were probably the most joyful because more people were taking them for recreational purposes. So when you do the survey of individuals, it might not be quite as exciting for if you're taking microtransit, but definitely the micromobility, I think, really kind of came to that. You know, and there was a few things I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, and Carlos, I would love for your kind of comments as well. There was a few things that really kind of struck with me that I was slightly surprised at when I talked to when we interviewed both the public agencies as well as the service providers. And once you start thinking about it, I think it makes a lot more sense. But definitely one of the things we heard pretty strongly from the service providers, and especially for micromobility, was that a lack of regulations were generally viewed as this Wild West environment, and it had a lot of negative outcomes. And it was something that you know, I think at the end of the day that the service providers, those companies were like, it doesn't, it's not a great environment if there are, you know, multiple companies that have, you know, hundreds of scooters that are kind of willy-nilly all over a city. You know, it doesn't look good for them. It's harder for them to, you know, to really make a business case and be really competitive. And so I was a little bit surprised at talking to the service providers at kind of their willingness and real acknowledgement that, you know, we're still trying to find out what the right level of regulation is, but there's probably a sweet spot for a certain amount of regulation that that both just makes all of this, especially if there's competing services, creates an environment where they can work together, and there's not so many of them that it's hard for any of them to really survive. I definitely would say there wasn't a level of, you know, this is the place that's doing it exactly right. So I think it's something that we're still trying to figure out. And it really does depend on the size of the market, probably the density, the layout of neighborhoods. There's a lot of components that really, I think, go into that to really kind of balance out the chaos that's potentially on the street and the, um, you know, but also an ability for the companies um, to hopefully make a profit, or at least, you know, make it worthwhile when they're getting farther into deployment.
There's one thing there that the question about this, how do companies or services come into operation? How do they agree with the government? Is fundamental in these new mobility services, because they don't really exist legally. Like you can't really put them into one typology because they have all these new characteristics. So that, I think, is one of the things that we've also in NUMO we're trying to sort of understand that and find concrete ways of moving forward.
Yeah. The other types of partnerships that, or modes that we were also paying attention to, I know I've talked a lot about the micromobility. That was definitely the mode that had the most pilots going on, but we were also paying attention to the TNC partnerships. So where was the local agency really working with Uber and Lyft or other TNCs to provide services? Also microtransit, and then we're also paying attention to passenger and autonomous vehicle goods delivery AVs, pilot projects. And so some of the things that struck out, and I would say it was for both TNC partnerships and microtransit, but a real question, and especially as you're starting to compare it to, you know, the e-scooters and e-bikes, what really is kind of the right level of subsidy that, you know, especially for the partnerships and microtransit, they're trying to provide a public good and provide a service that might not otherwise be provided by the marketplace. And so how should we be thinking about that subsidy? And you know, for the pilot, they've got funding, but then how do they think about that longer term? So that was a really interesting conversation that we had that was not resolved, but I think it's one that, you know, especially as we talk more and more about equity, you know, what are the, what's that right level to ensure that we have both equitable access as well? The other thing that I, you know, once we really started looking into it was seeing how some of the microtransit companies were really competing with TNCs for some of these services, and especially as it relates to transit, when federal transit money was available, some of those requirements for data, and I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more later on as well. You know, the microtransit companies were like, you know, we'll work with you and the data requirements that you have, and they were really competing with the TNCs. And so the competition was kind of an interesting factor as well. Carlos, did you have any as you were hearing about those other things that really kind of occurred to you?
Not yet. Let's keep going.
Okay. And thinking a little bit more about the passenger and goods delivery, that one we really wanted to include autonomous vehicles because we see a lot of parallels between what are we learning from, you know, these other emerging technology pilot projects and what does it mean for autonomous vehicles down the road. And I was hoping to see, you know, until we had done this, I wasn't sure just how strong the partnerships would be with the governmental agencies. But it really felt like, you know, a lot of these pilots are still really just testing the technology. There's not a lot of competition, mostly because they're still really kind of testing it out. Most of the passenger AV pilots that we looked at were really those slow speed shuttles. Um, and you know, and there's still only a limited number of places that the AVs really feel comfortable, whether it's because of uh, um, the condition of the infrastructure or they really want to stay away from snow and you know, kind of that extreme weather. That's definitely still an issue with quite a few companies. So those are a few things that just kind of stood out. Oop. Now I'm jumping ahead. Uh, so it was, like I had mentioned, we were really paying attention to what were the pilot project goals and the specific outcomes. And you can see this in the report itself a little bit bigger. And I know, Carlos, thank you so much for putting the link in the chat as well so folks can access that. But really kind of looking across, you know, we wanted to compare a little bit between, you know, what kinds of goals did the micromobility have compared to microtransit, compared to some of the autonomous vehicle services. And so, and these were just the most common goals. There's definitely were some other ones as well, but some of the most common goals that we saw, definitely, you know, everything from gauging the public interest to, I'm kind of surprised that increasing transportation options wasn't, you know, a little bit more common across all of them. But definitely a number of, when you're looking at the autonomous vehicle ones, wanting to be innovative or part of the new economy was, you know, for the autonomous vehicles, people wanting to be and communities wanting to be on the cutting edge was definitely right up there. And so we're really paying attention to those goals and then how the pilot projects are really helping to try to achieve them. And, you know, we specifically called this out front as one of the first recommended actions. And then the second recommended actions is to make sure that you actually document and pay attention to, you know, what your goal was, and then to report what did you learn from your pilot project. I was really surprised that of all of the 220 pilot projects we looked at, only about 11% came out with some kind of evaluation or final report that was easy to download on the internet. And it's not to say, I suspect that some of these other pilot projects have other kind of internal documentation that shows, you know, these are the things that we did. But, you know, I can't stress enough the importance of having this evaluation and being able to learn from each other. It's why we're all here today. And I just pulled up two of my favorite evaluation reports. City of Portland's Portland Bureau of Transportation's e-scooter findings report, and they've just I think they've just finished their second longer version. The Go Centennial from City of Centennial in Colorado, and Fair and Peers also did a really fabulous report. So if you're looking for some examples, those are two good ones. There's other great ones as well. But I wanted to stress, and this is where my technical advisory committee really came in and helped to think about what are the important things to be able to show in the evaluation report. And it's everything from just kind of the operational data, you know, what happened on your streets during the pilot or in your right-of-way, on your sidewalks. You know,
And
did
just
the,
another
yeah.
comment is sort of there's this, you were mentioning something about the duration of a pilot, and I try to come up with terms for these things, and I think there's a lot of eternal pilots, and it may also have to do with the fact that monitoring isn't so good. So then they say, well, let's keep on going and see how it's working and whether we want to extend. But having this rigid deadline and saying, let's really monitor and see whether it's making sense or not. Are we really achieving the outcomes that we had? And that is fundamental to the definition of having a pilot, because otherwise it's sort of not a pilot, it's just a deployment.
Yeah, and there was, I do remember there was one bike share pilot in a Texas community. And I think that they, like every year, they just kind of renew their pilot. And I think technically they might still be doing their pilot, but it's the same as what they did the year before and the year before that. And so it really starts to feel like deployment. But there was some good information from the first or second ones that we did include. And so getting back to the evaluation report, you know, the best ones, you know, really talk about the operational data. They also then do some analysis to really understand kind of the demand for the service and the utility of the service. You know, what times a day, you know, are people using the service? Is it supporting transit? You know, what are the things that are important to you and being able to analyze that. And then finally, kind of the overall evaluation related to the goals that you have and the outcomes that you achieve. So really going through and thinking through the equity component and the health and safety, environmental and economic. You know, those are definitely elements of great evaluation reports. So doing that critical analysis to make sure that you've achieved what you had hoped to achieve. The next two, I feel recommendations are really closely linked. And I can't say enough, I'm working on another project where in 4 different communities across the US, and the issues related to trust and the importance of building that trust and fostering those relationships. And for a public agency, it's not just, you know, it could be internal to your different departments, but definitely the residents and business owners, those stakeholders kind of locally that you are providing the service to, and then the companies themselves, and the importance both, that goes both ways of building trust and creating, I would say, the importance of creating that policy framework or whatever the regulations, the contracts, whatever kind of agreements, so that everybody is on the same page and expectations are very clear about who is going to be doing what. We talked to service providers who definitely reflected on the, you know, deploy first and ask permission later, and that the real challenges that built in, you know, down the road. So, you know, there might be some short-term gains, but long-term, it provided, it was just so much more challenging, and that they had to go back and rebuild some of those relationships, or that was even, you know, damaged by other companies. And so I guess I just want to, you know, really emphasize that. We also saw some pilots that out of the pilot, they said that they wanted to have more clarity and make it much more transparent when there are complaints from the public. How are those complaints addressed? How are they being taken care of? Or is the input from the public really being taken into consideration? And then having the pilot or the deployment in the future change? How is it going to affect policy? So all of those things were really important.
And just one minor comment, there is this underlying question again about what is allowed and what is legal, and then how within the legality of deployment, how can you build that trust? How should you modify things so that there is that trust and so that you can really sort of find the best way to experiment, which is also what the pilot is about.
Yeah, and we saw examples of places where they wanted to try an autonomous vehicle pilot and had to pivot when the backlash, when there wasn't that trust that was built up for a variety of reasons, and having to kind of rethink the pilot and do it a little bit differently. Uh, the next one was really fascinating as well, and so the next three recommendations. So building in compliance mechanisms. So this is the enforcement. What does your permit or your agreement say that each of the parties are going to do, and then how do you ensure that that actually happens? And so collecting information is an important component of that, and being able to do it in real time allows you to address issues that might potentially come up. Uh, it, and unsurprisingly, companies liked carrots a lot more than sticks. And so the service providers, really liked the incentive. If you behave well, then you get more vehicles, or you can expand your service area. But the jurisdictions themselves also have some sticks that they can provide to ensure that those requirements are really adhered to. And not just that, but then the companies did value that they wanted to make sure if they're going to be held to account by their permits, that their competitors are also going to be held to account. So it was, the importance of making sure that there's that compliance element and that it's applied fairly and equitably across all the different companies. And so, so we definitely heard that the imposing of uh, uh, order into the chaos that is the potential. I would also say, just kind of always coming back to the importance of understanding the impact of pilots on equity and, health and safety, make sure we're not killing people, the environment, and the economy. I know in both Austin and in the city of Portland micromobility pilot projects, they worked with the health with a health agency to measure, what kind of crashes did we see? What kind of health implications, did we experience? What was the safety? And without a doubt, it's been really fascinating since, doing this project, paying attention to some of the other kinds of pilot projects that are happening and what are the impacts on equity. Are we, providing those pilots equitably? And I'm thinking specifically of some of the slow streets and the desire to open up streets, but are we doing it in primarily, more affluent, less diverse locations, and not making sure that all people have those kinds of pilots and equitable service from that. And I guess I want to emphasize one of the things we pulled out was the importance of measuring the impact of the pilot project on transit, because of, over and over again, there's this emphasis on both equity as well as on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And transit is so critical for addressing both of those. That understanding that all of these types of emerging technology pilots we're talking about are transportation related, and they have an impact on transit. And so very few of the pilots that we saw are really thinking in depth about that relationship, except for some of the microtransit ones. And so I guess I just wanted to emphasize the importance of making sure that we're thinking about that. The next one, I promised that I would talk a little bit more about data and data requirements. This was a really interesting kind of to dive a little bit deeper, but I guess, out of looking at these pilot projects, it still feels very clear that if we are going to ensure the public good, and we can do that while protecting privacy, that it's important to make sure that we have the information that is needed to make just good data-based policy decisions. And so I actually pulled out some of the most common types of data that were collected in each of the different types of pilots. And so you can definitely see that there were many more types of data that were collected in micromobility pilot projects. And if my memory serves me correctly, actually, I believe that of the ones that we looked at, the 78 pilot projects, micromobility projects we looked at, it was just barely I want to say it was like 56% of those pilot projects required some kind of data. And this was the most common types of data that was required of those. But then almost half, not quite half, didn't require specific types of data. TNC partnerships, it was, a lot less information that was provided or asked for. Microtransit was even less than that. And the passenger and goods delivery AVs, very few of those relationships, I would say most of those were really just much more informal partnerships between the local government and the the companies themselves. And so they got very limited kinds of data. Almost everyone we talked to, every public agency, maybe a little less so for the micromobility case studies we looked at, but all the other case studies we looked at, all those public agencies said, I wish that we had better data. That was pretty universal. Carlos, what are your thoughts on
No, so
data?
there's this huge question about data, and I think there's two questions. First of all, whose data is it? And probably the data is actually from the person who's moving, and they should decide what data they are going to give. And then we've been struggling with a lot of cities with data because they all say, we need more. And they actually don't need more. They just need the data that they have better organized and to understand what data they need. And then they should start requesting. What normally governments do is that they ask the provider, give me everything, every location of every vehicle, every second. Literally, they ask for this. And they really don't, first of all, they don't know why, and they don't have a way of analyzing this. And I'm sure the same can be said of the companies. And it's rather a matter of saying, well, what is it that you're really going to use? I put a link in the chat just because Numo started working on that. And then there's this nice use case platform that may be useful to answer those questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks. The Open Mobility Foundation, of course, is working on thinking about data and the coordination of it. Other organizations are and associations are as well. The service providers themselves, those companies, all have opinions, and there's definitely real challenges and opportunities in how you organize, how you think about it, what you provide, and what you can actually do with it. And then finally, I really wanted to emphasize the importance of, we sometimes think about these as proxies. We learned a lot as transportation network companies and Uber and Lyft rolled out in cities, and that really changed how we thought about e-scooters when they descended on our city streets. And so we're learning from all of these different types of pilot projects, and it's going to have implications for new pilot projects and even new technologies like autonomous vehicles as they roll out. And so I still feel pretty strongly, even with COVID, even as things are changing, that these are pretty universal lessons that apply, I think, to all sorts of new types of technologies. And it's been fascinating too, in the importance of really planning for volatility, because man, have we knocked it out of the park with this one. It's been really fascinating to see how some of these pilots have pivoted. Government is not always known for being adaptive in a really constrained environment. Sometimes it's a little bit more slow moving. But we've seen, I would say, the city of Detroit, and I don't know if you want to talk about a little bit more, Carlos, because I know you've been involved, but they changed, they were planning a micromobility to work pilot project and then pivoted to provide longer term leases to essential workers. And I think it was both a hospital and and a grocery store worker. So they kind of targeted the employers and said, you know, we're going to provide your essential workers with a e-scooter if you live relatively close, within a mile or two. I don't know the exact distance, but if they live farther away, then they're going to provide a longer term lease for like an e-bike. And so they're conducting that pilot, I think, as we speak. And it will be
As we
interesting to,
speak.
yeah,
Yeah,
what they learned from that.
I'll be showing a little bit of that.
Fabulous. And then Miami-Dade County, I know that they're unfortunately had to cut service between midnight and 5 a.m. And so they did a partnership with TNC to provide, you know, those essential workers with transportation home during those hours when that transit line was had to be discontinued. So we're seeing, you know, public agencies adapting as they need to, and as we see things with climate change or other types of disruptions, other types of disasters, you know, it's great to see how we can be adaptive and really respond to the needs that are on the ground. And with that, Carlos, I might pass it over to you for a few minutes before we answer questions.
Okay, good. So yeah, just to take what Becky was saying, and I'm going to share actually my slides as a link also. Becky was talking about this volatility, and that, I mean, I guess we don't have to talk too much about it, but in Numo it's been interesting since we began, because we started to work on mobility disruptions, and then as we moved ahead, there were disruptions of the disruption, and then we had other disruptions. So then it's sort of, this is what we're going to have to live with. There's a sociologist who has this book called Liquid Modernity. It's pretty tough to understand, but it's basically that, like, everything is going to change all the time, so it's fine. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what we are doing with Numo in a few minutes that we have, but I left you the slide just so that you can browse. It doesn't have a ton of information, but I guess it's useful. I always have to say that Numo is here because of the shared mobility principles, which we look for in the website, but that is sort of our inspiration to keep working on these things. We're an alliance-based organization, and one of the topics that we're working on is implementing learning about pilots. And there's these few assumptions that we have. One is what Becky was also saying. We need to start to understand much better what is happening in these existing disruptions, in micromobility, in transit and microtransit, in ride-hailing and pooling, and all of these things, because they will help us inform everything that is coming. AV shuttles, AVs, maybe drones, and we don't know what else is coming. So I wrote a blog post in the Numo Medium blog that's about why we have to think about magic carpets, and that is sort of my shorthand phrase to say we don't know what's coming, and we need to know all these characteristics of all these things, because that is how we're going to be able to address all of this. And then if we could even start putting other things here, like COVID, the racial discussions that have been wonderfully coming up, and finally we have this very, very broad agreement that we have to start working on that more in depth. So that's sort of what we're working on. I did this drawing in 2018, which now seems like a decade ago, but it was sort of to try and explain how we have to engage people, start to do pilots, and then help inform that new normal. But then I wanted to sort of mention a few of the things that we've been doing. We've been helping Bogota in their scooter deployment. We have been part of the Pittsburgh initiative to develop this consortium and work on the deployment of separate shared mobility services. We're also working with Washington, D.C. on equity and pricing. We began working with them more on congestion pricing, but then we said, well, wait, we can't think about congestion pricing. We have to think more about equity first, and how congestion pricing may be one of the means with which we can arrive at that equity. And that was a very good way of changing. In Detroit, we're working on different things. I'm going to show a little bit more about that. We're also working in King County around engagement and equity. And we just finished the beginning of a pilot in Guadalajara, which is around mapping informal transport and providing people ways in which they can see where that informal transport is moving. I think I'm going to end with this sort of mentioning that we have these, I'm going to call the super fast micropilots, because COVID just created this huge amount of opportunities to do many different things that were very difficult to really let them go by in a second. So we did a hackathon in March. We then gave 400 bicycles to health staff in Bogota. They were e-bikes of Movo, which gave them for a full month. And then we said, well, we can also do this in Detroit, because we had a lot of different partners there. And then we started to give these scooters and e-bikes to essential workers in that city. And I would love to be in Detroit to be able to have those e-bikes, because they are the most beautiful e-bike I've ever seen. They're folding GM e-bike that I was very happy to see that they were being given away to the people who needed them the most. And then we're now working on recommendations for transit during COVID-19, which I started to work on just because I felt it was important, but then we started to see that everybody really wanted to see what was happening. And then we've come up with this nice sort of decision tree of how should you address COVID in transit in terms of ventilation of the system, if people are wearing face masks, if they have eye protection, if they're being silent, if the trips are being short. So I hope that we can start showing this more publicly to people after a while. I will not share the link yet because we're still working on this decision tree, but I hope that it will be available in the coming days or weeks. But then just because I have 2 more minutes, I'm going to just mention we have a bunch of tools that we either have been helping expand or creating from our side. I hope people have seen StreetMix. You have to register. It is a wonderful free open source platform. But the nice thing about StreetMix is that when you go there and you're registered like me, then you will be able to not only put specific vehicles there, but you will get these nice things of a survey that we're doing, like, is this street joyful? I'm not sure, more or less. And what we're starting to do with this is that we're going to implement a machine learning mechanism so that we can see how users assess streets. So StreetMix is a wonderful tool that I love to promote always because it's pretty nice. But we're also working on how to improve light for tech-enabled disruptions. We have the MoMobility card game, which I think if you write MoMobility on Google, it will actually show up. Let's hope it does. Okay, so you should go there. And then we actually can deliver it, but because of COVID, then we're actually doing a digital version that I'm happy to share. And then other stuff, which will take me very long to describe, but we are working on how to give recommendations to imaginary vehicles. We're working on how to do mobility hubs and integrate different services. We're working on how to do and implement a mobility wallet, how to do micro freight. And for those of you who have gone to the link, you can actually click here and there will be a full presentation there describing what we are working on. And you may need to get permission from me to see it, and I may not give you permission. That's life. Sometimes you don't have permission to see the Google Drive of somebody else. So that's it. I kept the time that we set, so now we're open for questions.
Great. Can you all see me and hear me? Great. Hello, I'm Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center and professor at University of Oregon, and thrilled to be part of the webinar today. So I have a number of questions that I have myself and some that some people have been asking over the course of the webinar. First question, kind of jumping off of what Carlos was talking about COVID, and there's 2 parts, one coming from some people that we were hearing from and one that I wanted to add. So one of the questions was, do you have any recommendations how to measure success of the COVID-19 pilots? Seems hard to correlate the pilots with specific positive or negative health outcomes. So are you able to do that? Are you trying to do that? And how do you do that?
Oh no, how much time do we have? I mean, Becky, do you want to say something? Because I have this very long spiel about this.
I'm gonna give you like 3 minutes because there's a bunch of other questions.
Okay, just stop me. Okay, so I'm going to share screen again. It doesn't matter. It is worth it. 3 minutes. Okay, so you know about the curve and everything about the curve. There's these very nice, very quick studies that have been coming out around this. One from Brookings, which is sort of looking at who needs to move and why in the city. And then yeah, I guess I should send the link to this also, because I'm just going to go through it quickly. But it is really looking at equity and mobility and when you need to let somebody move or not. So we've been trying, and I guess I've been trying, but I've been sort of trying to get people on board to sort of look at what is the epidemiology curve, how can we start to look at that epidemiology curve and come up with a quarantine operation and a non-quarantine operation, and how can we demonstrate that there's concrete actions that you have to do. Let's understand what is the threshold. Let's increase the service for all of those services that we really need people to have, like public transport and some of these other services. And then let's look at how do we learn from that so that the recovery mode, if there ever is one, because I think there won't be, because I'm a pessimist, but how can we start to think about that? And I think that there is a very concrete sort of series of steps in looking at that. Are we really increasing access while anyway reducing or restricting mobility? And are these people in these graphs better off because of the measures that we're taking in the transport sector? And that's my 3 minutes, right?
That's great.
I want to go back to
ahead,
that though. You know, like, and that's one of the key questions. Are people better off because of the pilots than they would have otherwise have been? And so it's important to understand kind of where are they right now and how did their life change because of it? Because if they're worse off, if transit service is worse off, then why would we be doing this? If it's more expensive, why would we be doing this? But if they're better off, then that's really something that's very important. So it's again, it's like being really clear about what are the outcomes you really want to see from the pilot, and then being able to measure that throughout the pilot and come out at the end and say, yeah, it you know, got us closer to that, it made life better, or it didn't.
All right, so related to that question is, you just did all this work with the pilots, as you mentioned at the beginning. This was done pre-COVID, the research. What sticks post-COVID? What do you think is, you know, we'll assume that most of the things are applicable for pilots, but what things do you think are kind of maybe highlighted, emphasized, most important, and what things might be less important as we look at, you know, potentially a number of months, hopefully not years, that we're in this COVID state?
You know, I think it's the confluence of the pandemic as well as all of the racial issues that have been at the forefront of everything we've been talking about. So really a renewed and a different emphasis on equity that I think has just been so important. And then layered on that, and it feels like everything is very layered, is the economic impact as those folks who are most vulnerable, having to travel sometimes in the most vulnerable ways. You know, what is the impact on the overall system if, you know, the more affluent folks just get into their car and drive, or even if you're less affluent but you feel like you have pre-existing conditions and you've got to spend more of your money to buy a new car that can get you to work where you need to go. Like, all of these things have implications, and it feels like really paying attention to, you know, what is the impact of this pilot project on the most vulnerable populations, and let's really try to address that and make those lives better. That's what feels like is one of the big changes going into the future. I don't know, Carlos has any.
Exactly. I mean, and I think it's not just COVID, like it's all these things that happening, just reiterate that we really, well, we need to do pilots, we need to understand what is happening, and we need to be flexible enough so that we can start implementing. One crucial thing of the whole COVID thing is that everybody just magically said, oh yeah, that is actually possible. We can let you do that. Like, every lawyer in every government has been able to do things. Every company of every tech-enabled disruption has been able to do things that they said, well, that's very difficult. So I think we have to start looking at that and then see how these lessons apply.
That's great. Let me ask you a question that came from Elliot Rose from Metro here in Portland. Can you talk a little more about the difference between trip origin destination locations that TNC partnerships provide and the trip origin destination data that microtransit pilots provide? You mentioned, Carlos, that everyone was asking for everything. Can you talk a little bit more about the nuance between what kind of data is being provided by different modes?
I mean, I think that is a very, very, very long discussion, and that it is difficult to say, well, what you need to give is exactly this list. I'm becoming a politician. So what I think is, what do you want? Like, what does the city want? Does the city want to reduce injuries? Like, is that the main thrust of their policy? Then start looking at that in greater detail. Do they want to reduce travel times? Do they want to increase the equity? So I think, let's assume a principle. I will only ask for the data that I really, really, really need. And then I will see what I'm going to ask for. And then I'm going to ask all these policy questions. But I guess the link that I sent on the policy, on the data policy, that is that answer. It's saying, well, what do you want? This is what you should do with data. So I'm going to direct people there. And Sebastian and our team will be very happy listening to this.
Becky, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think you know, governmental agencies are getting more sophisticated about both requesting specific types of data. They might have said at the beginning, I want all this data, or the service provider said, yeah, we can provide it. But then it was aggregated in ways that it wasn't always as useful as it could have been. You know, and some of it is, you know, when we're thinking about microtransit, it's usually either the origin or the destination on one end is always going to be at a transit stop. And so, you know, for some of these, you know, and if it's kind of a shuttle-like service, then you have a good sense of, you know exactly what the route is. But a lot of those, again, are kind of on demand. So to some extent, especially if the local government is subsidizing the service, you know, they might only be subsidizing it from that transit stop or in that certain geographic boundaries. And so they want to make sure that, you know, that's really where the rides were provided. But there was just a ton of variability. Even if somebody might say, you know, that they asked for and they got the trip and origin destination data, but it might look very different from somebody else's trip and origin, origination and destination information. So just a lot of variability still between different companies.
So let me shift a little bit. So talked about a lot of pilots, talked about best practices. In the end, the idea of pilots is to get to scalability, right? Like this is, we're testing things out to see what we can do. What do you, from the conversations you had, what kinds of things start to ring in your mind as like what's important for scalability? What makes pilots successful? In other words, like not just that they work, but that you're getting the information you need to take it to a larger level. And tied into that slightly, I'll just ask, what did you learn about profitability? You know, we've been hearing more and more that profitability is like, you know, transportation is not a profit, it's a low margin business. So how is that kind of tied into some of the pilots that you're seeing?
You know,
so two parts.
Yeah, when we were first talking about volatility, you know, one of the things that we discussed both with our technical advisory committee and with the other cities and groups, you know, was seeing companies that are in the space and then that were going out of business, you know, like, so there was a lot of new entries and exits on a pretty regular basis. And so if you only had, you know, one service provider for that particular mode, then you might see that service totally go away. And so, you know, that's pretty big volatility. And so there's kind of that combination of, you know, is a service provider going to be around, and are they, you know, they're all in it to make money. They're not providing a charity service or, you know, volunteering their services. And so they need to do that. And right now they're, you know, fueled by funds. They can take a loss for a while, but not forever. And so it kind of comes back to that question too, especially like those TNC partnerships in the microtransit, and eventually even some of the pilots that we're seeing develop around autonomous vehicles that the public sector is paying for, to see, you know, can we provide that public good, but then how do we really pay for it, and how does that deployment go on in the future? And I think there's a lot of questions, especially with all the, how the pandemic is affecting public agency budgets, both transit budgets, cities, counties, states. It just is putting a lot of uncertainty into the equation. Carlos, I don't know if you've got kind of other thoughts on this.
I mean, I think one interesting thing about this particular work is that it is focusing on new mobility and doing pilots in new mobility. And a characteristic of new mobility is that the question about profit is a very risk, like it's based a lot on rather how venture capital has been supporting many of these ideas even or initiatives or services. Like AV shuttles or AV in itself is mostly fueled by venture capital. So then profit is, well, the question about profit is a question about how can we make this profitable in the medium term, and how can we really test this that it is working. And I was sort of, all of 2019, we had a question in NUMO, which was later answered very clearly. And it was, are we really sort of in a bubble of this beautiful services of micromobility, like the jump bikes, which are the perfect bike? Like there's these wonderful things that were happening in cities that we were like, how come we are having this? Like this is, we're too, I mean, this is too good for us. And it was, I mean, in the end it was, no? Because it was sort of companies looking at how this could become profitable and finding out that they had to either make huge changes or cities would have to make fundamental sacrifices before they were going to become profitable. So I think this sort of trying to understand this exactly in the year where there were so many of these was really good to sort of see, okay, let's assume that this is going to work. What lessons can we take? And now that we have these newer findings about how it really works, how it was really fueled, many of these were really fueled by great amounts of money, which made it possible to even be in a pilot. So, I mean, I think it raises more questions about profitability, but it also was very interesting to see this in the year where we saw much more of that happening.
So I think I'm going to squeeze in one last question that hopefully you have a quick answer, but I think it's an important one to point out to. Everyone, when we were looking at these pilots, most people are looking at how is it set up? What is the regulation? One of the things you point towards is the relationship development being really important. And it seems in a lot of work that we've been doing at Urbanism Next, trust seems to be like a super important piece of this. What would you say about the importance, the role of trust, how to create it, how not to create it? You have like 30 seconds each to answer that because we're almost out of time.
I think it's really important to be clear about what you need out of the project and then communicating that clearly to the partner that you're trying to work with. So both a combination of what do you have control over and what you don't have control over, like what you can shape and what you can't shape, but then also, so having an understanding of your own needs and then really listening to what the other stakeholder needs as well, and working really hard to come up with as many, co-benefits as possible, and working it really in good faith and being clear about what you can do and setting those expectations. It's just good relationship building.
Yeah, and so I'm a psychologist. So then when you ask these questions, I sort of like really go back into the core of humanity. But I think the main thing is to be sincere. Like everybody who is engaging in a deployment should be sincere regarding what they really want to get out of it. Because many times it's like, oh, we want to help the city. And it's not really true. Like sometimes they really want to test the technology and they should say, well, we really want to test this. We have these doubts. We want to see this. And then the city can say, okay, if that's your interest, then we can do it in this way. And when there is this sincerity from both sides, then it's much clearer what they can do. Like I've been working in cities in Latin America for a much longer time than in the US. And in Latin America, it is very typical of everybody to say, well, I think that this should be what we would do. And they're like thinking something completely different. And this lack of sincerity really makes things take much longer and and make people fight, basically. So then this thing about trust needs this sincerity to be there from the beginning, and every now and then say, well, this is not working because of this, this, and that. But sort of keeping the cards close to their chest and sort of saying what is not exactly what they're feeling is a difficult thing to generate the trust and to have success. But it's already 1 minute past, and I think we have to finish.
I was just looking at the time as well. Carlos, thank you so much, both for being a partner on this project, really providing the support. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the other authors at University of Oregon. We had some fabulous students, Grace Kaplan and Juliet Koya, as well as Amanda Howell, who works here on the project, and a fabulous technical advisory committee. All the folks that were a part of that really helped to shape and make it a much more valuable and usable report. So I'm really thrilled, and thanks again. And with that, we are working on future webinars and are excited to bring those to you. If you hadn't been on our mailing list before, you will be now. And so just keep an eye on your email as well as on our website, urbanismnext.org. We'll be announcing more of those. And with that, thank you, Nico. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was great.
Great webinar.
Thanks. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.